Our next guest for today is another returning champion from React Wednesdays. We've got Michael Labriola. Mike, man, how's it going?
I'm doing. How about you?
I am doing okay. Why don't you
We're
tell
two for
people?
two for guests showing up, so things are
Yeah,
great.
you made my blood pressure spike there a little bit because you came in right at the last minute there, but you're here. I trust you.
I'll rephrase. He came in right on time.
Yeah, he did come in right on time, so I'm not. It's totally fine. It's no issue.
To be fair, that's my fault and my misunderstanding. I apologize. I actually saw the invite for 15 minutes before, and I'm like, oh, he sent me the invite for 15 minutes before. So I'm glad that I am, in fact, prompt to what I was expecting to do, even though my misunderstanding was there. So that's cool.
Surprise.
It all works out. All's well that ends well, right?
Yeah. So you want to tell people who you are, what you do, all that good sort of stuff?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, no. I'm Mike Labriola. I work with a company called Digital Primates, but we do a lot of React and specifically a lot of React Enterprise stuff. So have worked with Dan in the past, have as we've talked about, been a guest host on React Wednesday a number of times for a little bit of fun and playing around with these different sorts of React-y pieces. So I've been in React a long time. I've been in JavaScript quite a while and some things before that. But honestly, what I do is I try to solve what turn out to be large problems that maybe hopefully started a little bit smaller than that for people in enterprises. So that's a lot of what I do. It's kind of a fun game that I play, and sometimes I'm even successful at it.
Well, very cool. And we're talking about a nice, easy topic today. We're going to be talking about React contexts. So, I mean, I'm definitely an expert on this. I know we've talked about this before, but for people out there that aren't, maybe you could set the stage for just the beginner level, right? What are contexts? Why would you want to use them? And then maybe we can then go from there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And not only is it fair, but to be honest, we'll kind of meander through today a little bit and see where we go in terms of all this. There's a lot to cover here, which is why I say it that way. So React contexts are basically a way that React and the React team has developed to distribute information throughout an application. So a good way to put it is that we have all been in the area of doing what's called prop drilling, right? And prop drilling is just the term for saying, hey, we need to get some information from way up here to way down there, and we need to do it in a reasonable time or a reasonable approach, hopefully. Now, the thing with prop drilling is that prop drilling is fine and it works really well, and there's no real problem with it, but it's cumbersome. If I have a pretty big application that starts way up here and I have a bunch of information that has to be distributed all the way down, what I have to do is pass it through each level, okay? And there's ways to deal with that, like you can do spreading of props and things of that nature, but that has other consequences, sometimes unintended, because of the fact that we are maybe either carrying all the props through, and maybe we don't want to, maybe we don't even understand that is happening, or realize what we're passing along with things. So all this prop management stuff can get kind of tricky and kind of difficult. So what do we do is the question. How do we get something from point A to point B? Well, there's a bunch of different ways, right? And a lot of these take advantage of context behind the scenes, but oftentimes we talk about things like state management, whether it be Redux, Recoil, pick your flavor. And people do these as ways of managing state in an application. And part of the goal there is to avoid this idea of prop drilling. It's how do I avoid moving things around? Now, that said, all those are really good ways to do it. So this isn't an anti-anything talk, right? All of those are really good ways to go about it. But sometimes those are big overarching strategies for an application as a whole. And realistically, we don't necessarily always need a strategy for the application as a whole, or maybe we only need to manage a tiny little thing, but we still have to have this idea of like, how do we manage it from an umbrella perspective? And that's where contexts come in. So I like to think about them, if everyone can imagine for a moment, a tree of your application basically being a big tree. Context let you pick a branch on that tree. That could be at the trunk, or it could be any branch in between, and say, I want to provide a value to everything under this point. Meaning, and under my tree's upside down, just so we're clear. But from that branch going out, all the children, whether they be other branches or leaves from that point on, I want to provide a value to. Okay, and I want to be able to do that, but I want to be able to do it in such a way that I don't have to manually pass that prop down. In other words, if I started at the top of the application and I logged in, it's great. I have some username property. But do I, in fact, actually want to pass that to my first view, the username, and then I want to pass that to, I don't know, some shopping cart, to this, to this, to this, to this, this, all the way to get it down to the screen where I'm going to check out? Seems kind of silly. And additionally, it actually maybe sets up some bad scenarios, right? It
Yeah.
means that the components in between need to know about information maybe that they don't really need to know about. So it gets kind of tricky. So there is a need to distribute information, and contexts or things built on contexts are intended to do those for us. So that's my, like, you asked for like a 2-second summary, I think, and I don't do 2 seconds, but I got you further.
It was good.
Descriptive enough, and it made a lot of sense. I mean, I think one principle we try to do is make our code as unaware of its surroundings as possible, encapsulated and whatnot. And if you're shoving props down a whole bunch of nodes, it seems like things know more than they should.
Way more than they should, right?
And
Which
I
makes
also
things break. Sorry, TJ.
no, I also like your phrasing of there's no hard and fast rules here, and I think that's sometimes one of the more frustrating parts, because it would be way easier if there was like this is the way you do it. But I mean, it really does depend, like what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to do. But in a way, that's not a horrible thing. Like in React contexts are a super valuable tool for
if you came out of
around.
anything from what we're doing today, because I've watched, obviously, just like you, a lot of context things in the past, and people tend to highlight the like, hey, this is what a context is, what it works, but it tends to be real tactical, as in this is how to put things together, and we'll cover a little bit of that. But to be honest, the value I feel like I could convey today, if we talk about it, is really what's happening, and also why you have to be just a little bit careful, because these are really powerful, really cool things. But Uncle Ben was really clear that with great power comes great responsibility, and this holds up here as well. So I think the big gist is that this is a really powerful concept, and it's really cool, and it's great, and the fact that this is added to React is there. But as you noted, no hard and fast rules also leave people wondering, right? Which is, there's about 1 million articles after React Context came out. They're like, I can replace Redux. I don't need this anymore. And then there was like the next wave of articles that were like, I replaced Redux and it sucked because everything's much slower now.
And joys of over rotation.
Right, exactly. It's like we're on the pendulum hanging on for dear life as we flip from one side of the clock to the other. But the general gist of this is that all of these things are tools, right? And I promise you, there is no tool you're going to pick up and be like, yeah, and I know it's tried and overused and hammers and nails and all that crap. But the gist of the thing is that, yeah, it's a tool, right? All of these are tools. So if you kind of know what it does, even if you're not perfect on it, and you kind of know the areas to look out for, then maybe, just maybe, you could figure out how to use that tool and not lose a finger, which is the real goal.
I've only got 9 left.
Yeah.
There was that one hammer incident.
At least it was only a hammer.
The hammer threw a null pointer exception, and I took the L on it.
Dan's heard me say this before, but I'm confident that the world is going to be one day saved from our robot takeover by a null pointer exception. So it'll be on the last cusp. Humanity will almost be dead, and then there'll be a null pointer exception. Everyone will be saved.
I worked with a guy who actually did lose a finger to a lawnmower. And
way to bring us down, buddy. Way to bring us down.
Yeah, I started hearing it. But what's funny is he was always a good sport about anything. So like anytime that those jokes came up, he was like on it, right? Like he played along perfectly, and he was okay. He was fine. He talked about how he developed a slightly different typing technique because when one finger is out of commission.
Well, I have all mine,
random story of the day.
My typing any worse if I lost a few. I can promise you that.
Yeah, hunt and peck this is fast.
Well, Mike, how do you want to tackle this? Are you gonna walk us through some stuff, or how are we gonna do this?
Yeah. So what we're gonna do is this, or at least this is my thought. All right, but we can be pretty flexible on how this goes down. By the way, TJ, sorry, my progress dice are still hanging in the back here.
Oh,
so
nice.
Here to do that backward as you're trying to like. All right, so here the gist of this though is I thought we would look at the basics first. Things that are out there, but setting up a context, right? But I want to take a little bit deeper version of it, meaning I would like to say, okay, this is setting up a context, but this is what this means. This is what you're doing. And maybe just spend a little bit of time peppering in some like why and what in there. Okay.
Yep.
And then my real goal, which is kind of interesting, is I'm less concerned today, although I will give people who are more advanced and interested the hints on how to solve it. But I'm more interested in demonstrating the problem that things like Redux and others are solving. Okay. And I will also point folks to it. In fact, I'll kick this to you in chat in a moment, and you don't put it out there right now, but there's a long thread on this stuff that is great that you can point the viewers to later if they want to read up some stuff and really feel like geeking out.
Yep.
Because there's a big long thread on some of the on GitHub for React about some of this stuff. So my thought is, let's talk about context. Let's get one wired up. Let's show the basics of how it could work. And then right as it's like, oh, that's a great solution, let's destroy everybody's hope and explain why it's breaking everything. Okay. And then after
so far.
Yeah, and then after that works, let's talk a little bit about how, because remember, Redux and things use context under the hood. Let's talk just a little bit about how they actually handle that and what they do to get around it and why that's better. And then we'll point people to the thread there, and then we'll see where we're at, because that already sounds like a lot to talk about. So you might have to keep me on time a little bit, considering I already was 15 minutes off for the day. Really, realistically, I think we have to have some expectations of how this is going to go.
No, you're good, man. I'm excited. So why don't we, with that in mind, why don't we just dive right in? Because that sounds like a good plan.
All right, cool. So what we're going to do is, and I'm going to share my screen here in a moment, but I'm going to do a little bit less live coding and a little bit more just pointing out stuff as we go along, because there's a lot of things in here to cover. And so I probably retype a couple things. We might bounce between it and talk about it, but I was a little worried about running out of time if I tried to type everything today. So we're going to go a little bit more pointy sort of gesticulation magic. All right.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
All right, cool. So let's go here, because that's probably really confusing for everybody as I was sharing the screen of everyone looking at stuff.
You're
All
good.
right, so here's the gist. TJ, you'll be familiar with this app that I've gotten a lot of mileage out of, which is my my Blackjack app. I have spent so many hours using this thing and rewriting it in 50 different ways for fun. But for those of you who unfortunately missed DevReach and TJ's work there, this was a little Blackjack app that we wrote that went off and just kind of played Blackjack, and it uses some reducers and some React pieces. All right. But what I thought, because I don't run a casino, and I clearly shouldn't, that it might be useful to find out your win-loss ratio is in your deal button. So by the time you're about to play another game, it's just that sort of reminder that the house always wins and that you're probably going to lose. So again, not a good reason, and I shouldn't run casinos, because eventually you're not going to click that button when you see like 1 out of 358 chances, right?
You know, we could license this to Gamblers Anonymous, I think.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Like this is your reinforcement version of it. So I'm like, all right, well that seems like a reasonable way to do it. Now, why I did this with a context, and here's a couple of reasons why. I want to think about this for a moment, which is that this screen is about playing the game, but this information, the how many I won and lost, is sort of above or outside the context of any one hand I'm playing at the moment, right? It is information that is, we can think about it as a higher level, or we can think about it as a little up that tree, my upside down tree I was talking about, which is that it's information that would pertain and persist across lots of hands, across lots of games, because we may play more than one game. So that information is a little bit higher up in the application. It's a little more important. One of the folks that we had on that did React Context use it for authentication. I use it all the time for authentication. I think it's a great way to do it, because those, again, are concerns that apply to a whole area of the application and not specific to a view. So that's your first rule, right? When we start thinking about a context, we should think about something that is governing some sort of information that need to be distributed to an area of the application and need to persist outside of sort of the rendering cycle of that given area. Remember, things like use state, if a component, we're going to use the old terms, but unmounts, if it's no longer in existence and then it's recreated, the state gets recreated with it. So if we want something that's going to hold on the state and be a little bit more persistent, we need to have it a little higher in the stack, okay? Also, again, it's not that we should do this for everywhere, but use context is very tree-like, which means that you could picture, let's imagine that we had 2 hands going or something, or like the dealer and the player here. You can imagine that context being like this could be the realm of the dealer, this could be the realm of the player, or probably more specifically, or less specifically, but more or generally or more practically, you could think about it if I had some sort of site that was comparing two things. The context of the thing on the left might be here, and the context of the thing on the right is here. And they may have the same properties, but they're kind of in two different areas of the application. So contexts are basically letting us kind of share information to a tree of things. So in this case, I'm just doing one of them, but it's sharing to a tree, which is going to be where all the games run in, right?
Yep, I'm with you.
All right, so to create that context, first clues are that we talked about this being above something in a tree. And so just like any other React component, that's exactly how it works. So in this case, and we're going to go backwards intentionally here, I created a game context. And this fancy syntax with providers and consumers we'll talk about, but basically the game context, as you can see, is surrounding my blackjack game. So maybe I have a whole casino worth of games here, and the game context wants to keep track of how I'm doing across all those games. It's totally possible too. But the game context surrounds the blackjack because it's going to provide information to not only blackjack, but any component under blackjack all the way down. Okay, anybody will be able to do that. I can, by the way, as we've seen in other things, context can be in context. So while this wouldn't make a whole lot of sense in this case, if I were to have something like this, it's totally legal because I can nest context, which would mean blackjack has access to this one and this one. More specifically, if we were to kind of go with examples that you'd see online, we could say that, hey, first we had to authenticate, and now that would mean that blackjack had the ability to understand who the authenticated user was and the game they were in. Okay?
Yep, makes sense.
All right, so we have a hierarchy that we're starting with. So here's our hierarchy, and we're saying game context surrounds this. Now, for all intents and purposes, these things are they're React functions, okay? But they're kind of component-like, which means they follow a lot of the same rules that React components do. And that's actually what can get us in trouble as well. But if you'll notice, game context looks kind of like another React component, and I'm going to give it a property here called value. Now, that value, whatever I give it, is what's going to be available down the road here. And we're going to see that probably next. We're going to bounce a little bit around so we can make sure we get it. But in this context of game context here with Blackjack, we need to understand that React is going to render these things just like it does any component. It's going to render game context. And if something on the game context level changes, it's going to render game context and everything below it, because that's what you do in sort of React, and that's a functional piece. If something in Blackjack changes, it'll just render Blackjack. Okay, that shouldn't be a surprise if we thought of these as components and just ignored the fact that they were something special right now. Let's go take a look, before we get into the default value stuff here, let's go take a look at the game context itself. Now, setting up context is really easy for the most basic examples. This is literally the most basic thing you could possibly do with it, right? We can go a lot further and probably should, but that's okay for right now. All right, so first off, when you call React create context, you're creating a context. When you create the context, again, just think about it as this sort of component that's in the line of all the things that are going to render that's going to be able to hold on to one thing for you, which is a value. And so when you create a context, you pass an initial value. Now, here is the first thing that gets confusing to everybody, is how this initial value property is used. When I try to use the context, okay, I'm going to potentially have components in my application. And right now I've got a pretty good version of how they fit together. But as soon as we start doing things like context, if we're not careful, we can get into problems if we want to do testing or anything else. Because what happens when I now make this tree and I put this context here at the beginning of it, but there's some component down there that's going to use it, but I kind of wanted to test that without the rest of the application, could get kind of confusing. So this initial value, which actually probably I'm going to rename it right now, call it default value, is the value that will be given to anybody who asks for the game context value if it's not overridden or if it's not somewhere in the app. So what do I mean by that? All right, well, I'm going to bounce back here. I told you we're going to bounce around a little, so stick with me. When we use a context, we will use this context syntax, okay? When we use one, it's going to give us a current value from that context. So shouldn't be a surprise from what I said so far. It's about sharing values. But what if I didn't do this? What if I forgot to do this? Or what if I was taking this and I was trying to test Blackjack outside of the rest of the app? Well, what would happen if somebody asked for the value of game context? That's actually what this parameter does. It's not a starting point. It's not an initial value. It's a value that'll be given to anybody that asks for the value of game context if the developer hasn't defined one. Does that make sense? Does that my description make enough sense, TJ?
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. Like it just so that something's there. And I think in this case, you probably want an object because a lot of code like sort of depends on there being an object and just like for property checks and things like that, just so you have a reasonable thing there.
Exactly. And I didn't do it yet, but that was part of what we were going to do is that mine actually has 3 properties. And so we won't worry about these are right now, but a proper way to handle this would be that I would always want this to be the shape of something that looked a lot like whatever I wanted to use it somewhere else, so that if somebody screws up and forgets to put something in here, that I would be okay, right?
Yeah.
Is that I would be able to do that. Oh, sorry. That's not equal signs. All right. So we want to have this thing be this sort of thing that we aren't going to crash if somebody forgets to do it. Maybe we'd actually just want to put something in here, which is like council warning or something, being like, "Hey, dummy, you're dispatching something, and I don't even have a context." Those are all useful things, but I've seen a lot of developers, and I understand it. They do try to clarify this in the React docs, but a lot of people end up using this and thinking that that's what they're going to get as a starting value. That's not what it means. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Now, technically, anywhere in the world, when I want to use it, I can call use context, which is that command right there. This, I'm going to point out, is just a convention that a lot of people do to make things a little easier. You see, if I have this game context here, I've got to remember, people are going to have to either remember this name and this one's a very simple example, so it's no big deal, but maybe there's some other things I want to do every time you use a context. So a lot of people just make their own custom hook, in this case, use game context, which when you call that, does this work of using a context for you, but kind of would encapsulate anything. So don't get freaked out by this. This is just saying use context, game context. We're just happen to be throwing in an extra hook. So think about it as kind of an alias. All right.
Yep.
All right. So that's your most basic version. That's it. That gets you up and running with a context with one exception, which is that when I provide a context, I need to give it the value. And that's where the real magic comes in. Now, some people take that value and they actually provide it right inside of the game context. So all the logic will be in here. Other people have it out here and provide a value. I went with a really simple route for this demo, but the gist is I have to figure out some way to give this a context state, okay? And I called a context state, it doesn't matter. It just means the value that people are going to get if they ask for the value of game context, okay? So in my case here, I kept this really dumb. I have a little use reducer. It just has a wins and a losses, and I'll get to how we're distributing the dispatch in a bit, but think about it as having wins and losses, okay?
Yep.
So all we have is that is there. And so what's going to happen in the game is that as I completely go and mess things up here and keep doing it, I'm going to see my wins and losses continue to tally up. Now, how am I doing that? Well, back in blackjack land, eventually I need to use that context. So in my case, I'm saying use game context, and I'm doing it inside of controls. Now, this is important because this is where we talk about prop drilling. If we come back all the way down here to the initial function for this thing, which is blackjack or whatever it is, down here, this is what makes the screen. And I'm just going to go through these sections. First, I have the dealer's hand. I've got some status about whether I'm winning. I've got some controls, which are the buttons, and I've got the player's hand. Okay, but you won't see me talking about wins or losses anywhere in here. They're not in the props. They're not in the state for the blackjack game. Instead, the first time you'll see me get to wins and losses is in this controls component, meaning that this hand doesn't know anything about wins or losses totals. This thing doesn't know about wins or losses. This whole screen doesn't know anything about wins or losses, but this little controls component does. And in fact, if I wanted to go just a little bit further, I could technically make a custom version of the button, which just did. In other words, I've gone to a pretty narrow place, which had to understand about wins and losses instead of taking this thing and passing it down and passing it down and passing it down and passing it down. All right, and that's the goal of context. So in here, I'm doing a couple things, and some of it's a little hacky, but you'll live with it because you guys like me.
Real quick, before you dive into that, we did have one request. Could you bump up the font size one notch real quick?
How's that?
All right. It's good. I'm ready now to process this.
Okay, all good. And sometimes it's already like about, I don't know, it feels about an 83-point font on my side. So we're cool. But yeah, please ask if there's anything I can do for you like that.
We're good. I'm ready for this.
All right, cool. So was that one request from you, TJ, or someone else?
No, it came in from the chat, but like I'm
All good.
squinting with my glasses here too. So
Okay. All right. So we're going to ignore this use effect and we're going to come back to that. But right now we're going to say there's wins and losses. And all I'm doing is saying, great, get the wins and losses from the context and put them on that button with deal. Okay. So this is coming all the way from the top down to here without drilling through all the properties in between to give me wins and losses. And this dispatch, which is really in this case, just the dispatch going, wrong one, just the dispatch going back to my use reducer up in the app level, which is going to keep track of my current wins and losses, is right here. And so, and I keep clicking on the wrong thing, is right here. So in the case that I've got a very simple use effect, it's a little hacky, that's okay. If the player goes bust or the dealer wins, I go ahead and dispatch and say I lost. If I win or the dealer goes bust, then I dispatch a win. And that thing is just going to keep changing the count up here in the application. So at the end of the day, if we go to here, won't get into the mechanism today in which this is working. It doesn't much matter, to be honest, but we'll say if we go looking +1, it's real simple. A win means we add 1 to the wins. A loss means we add 1 to the losses, and a reset just resets them. All right. So that gives us this net part here of doing this and going through, and that's all cool. Now, to show the next thing, I don't want to keep playing blackjack over and over again. So I did one other thing here just to make this a little bit easier on what we're trying to do. I threw some buttons at the end that just do that win, lose, and reset all by ourselves, just so I can crank up that number without actually having to play through every hand, okay?
Gotcha.
Another thing we could license to gamblers.
I was gonna say I need that. I'm gonna need that for some online gambling sites, right?
Yeah, that is the very special premium button that you can get.
Yeah, let's teach people that work on like gambling websites how to build their own backdoor to cheat the system. That would be some good content.
It's funny, I had this discussion with somebody earlier today who we built the entire AWS server instance for them, and they took it and they didn't do any review on it, and they put it live, and now they're concerned about giving us access because it might be a security breach. And I would like to explain to them a couple of things, but it seems against my best interest to explain how backdoors would work. All right, so anyway, wins and losses that we can go ahead and do here, and we can reset it. All right, just so I don't have to keep playing blackjack. But here's the bad thing. We talked about not doing prop drilling, and that's awesome. But the basic rules of React suggest that if provider changes, then blackjack needs to change and everything needs to re-render it. Yep. So I just went ahead and did something, and here, just for good measure, which is I went to our card, which is just the one that actually generates one of these cards. And I just put a little log statement in here for rendering, okay? So I'm going to go and I'm going to open this up, and this is definitely the poor man's profiler, okay? But we're going to do this, and we're going to bump that up a little bit, and I'm going to clear this. And so you'd expect that there'll be some rendering of images when these things change, okay? All right, that makes sense. But now, here's the tricky part. I'm only going to change win and lose, which is only going to change this button and has nothing to do with these or these. But when I do that,
it'll re-render.
It's re-rendering like crazy. And this is the source of all the articles that say, I changed out my Redux application to React context and everything went to hell.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can imagine, especially because, I mean, the whole point of these contexts is oftentimes they're at the root or whatever, right? So you change something in there, like you don't want to re-render everything. It's like the worst thing to do.
At least usually don't, right? Like, so actually that was one of the things I mentioned on like their call when we did context, is that it's a great reason for authentication context, because you can say, hey, if I change the authentication, I do want to dump everything underneath it and change it, right?
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it's cool. From this perspective, it's awful. All right, so this is the root cause of what it is to get into this sort of Redux-y problem, or not Redux, it's not Redux's problem, but the idea of React context is that because of the fact that they get away from property drilling for us, it makes it seem and maybe lures us into a false sense of security about how things work. But at the end of the day, there's still things being passed around. There's still re-renders. There's still this happening. It just means we're not passing them, right? So this is the crux of the problem that everybody is trying to solve, and in different ways. And that's kind of the gist of where this goes. Now, TJ, if you're up for it, and I think I still have it in here, this would be a good time to also drop that link that I sent you out there, okay?
I'm on it.
Cool. And I might go grab it as well and bring it up here real quick. Yep, I actually already had it. Look at that. I was prepared and didn't realize. Okay, so this is really quickly probably one of the best things you can read if you want to really understand how all of this is working behind the scenes and what the problems are. This was an RFC for something called context selectors, because somebody basically said, hey, this sucks. I only wanted wins and losses, so why don't you just let me select the fact that I only cared about wins and losses and only re-render me if one of those two things changes. Now, it doesn't mean that it has a resolution, because if you'll notice, it's open. However, there's a couple of discussions that you could read through in here if you wanted to. Again, huge, great value in here if you're willing to spend the time, because you will learn so much about what's actually happening and how people are trying to approach it. There are a couple people out there in what's called user space, which basically means anyone who's not on the React team, on how they might go about solving it or what they would like to do. And there's even a few examples out there to do it. But you'll see they're also all dealing with kind of the same sort of problem. How do we go about doing it? So let's talk about what's actually happening. And the Redux folks have chimed in on here. And by the way, it'll give you a ton of information on how to, and what you can see, and even how these different things are working, okay? But the gist of this is that we can't actually do this. And by the way, all that scrolling is with the 26 hidden items. But this will drive you a little bit mad, but it's okay. And so that's going to take us now into the pivot of talking a little bit about how people have solved it and why. And again, maybe we'll do another one sometime if you're interested, and we can actually get into how to solve it, but it would definitely be an intense session to get done. But let's get into why and what we have to do. So the reason that this is tricky here is because up here, we've had to change this state, right? Which was the wins and losses. And in changing this state, we had to provide a new value to the context, and we had to provide a new value all the way down through blackjack. So what Redux and what everyone else is doing, that not everybody else, but what a lot of other folks that are doing is they've recognized the fact that in order to solve this problem properly, you can't send something in that changes. Now that sounds a little silly, right? What do I want to do where I send in something to the provider, but it's not something that changes? But that's something we have. And it's something we have in a lot of places, and there's a lot of different solutions to it. So if you're an RxJS-y kind of folks person, you know about subscriptions, which is that you subscribe to an object. If you're an event dispatcher kind of person, or a signals type of person, you might have the idea of understanding that you can subscribe and get information back. So what if, instead of providing some type of context state down, what if we could provide something that looked more like some type of event dispatcher, okay? Or something that was, and this is the most important part, something that is 100% stable, meaning it itself doesn't change, okay? It internally is going to be the same reference from the time I create it until we're all done. But what if I could subscribe to that thing and have it tell me when updates needed to happen or when changes need to happen? Okay. In other words, how do I actually get to the point where, sorry, wrong button. How do I actually get to the point where I could go ahead and pull off the, man, I cannot click the right button today. Sorry. I think it's because my font's 1,000 points. Just give me 1 second here. All right, I give up.
Has appreciated the larger fonts though.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's just like there's not even space to click anything anymore. All right, cool. So, but there's a question there is like, how would I manage to do so? Okay, how would I actually pull apart something where I could distribute something that was stable? So just from the RX perspective again for a moment, what if I was able to, and again, you don't have to know RX to know this, but a subject is kind of something that is stable and subscribed. So if I was an RX kind of person, which I am, I could distribute something that was a subject. And what does that mean? It means something that is going to be 100% the same, but will notify other people of changes. Okay. And if I was a Reduxy sort of person, what are they doing behind the scenes? They have a custom event dispatcher. So just like you have a DOM event where you can register for on click, but the button didn't really change, it just notified you that something happened, we can do the same sort of thing. We can send something downstream that in itself doesn't actually change, but could in fact be responsible for the types of things that we eventually want to do. Okay. Is that making a little bit of sense?
It does, but then at that point, I'm wondering what's the value in using context? Because
I'm so glad you asked.
Because why not? Why wouldn't I just dictate everything? Just let RxJS or Redux or whatever just control all the things.
Sure. So let's talk about that, right? The value of context wasn't always that we could, or the value of context is that we can give a whole area of the application some form of information, right? Something that we want to share. So what if we can still do that? What if we can still share something and then just notify the individual areas of the application when something changed, right? That would still be valuable here because we could say, you know what? There's something you can subscribe to that would tell you anytime that something changed, for instance, the number of wins and losses, even if it didn't mean that you, I could still do all of the same things I did, right? But I can do it now with distributing it without prop drilling, without any of those other sorts of things, but I can do it in such a way that doesn't cause refreshes everywhere. Does that answer a question a little bit? I know it's a little obtuse, and we will look at an example here in a moment. I just want to kind of show you something.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it almost like it just plays nice with the React sort of approach for doing things in the tree and stuff like that. And it's almost just exposing you to the fact that these things are out there and available to you, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, so think about it as instead of distributing the data, we're distributing a way to get to be notified of the most up-to-date data.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So
and just as a quick time check, we got about 5-ish minutes.
Perfect. Because what we're going to do just really quickly is just look at this one piece, and I'm just going to describe it. Now here, just to be fair, this is RxJS code, but you don't really need to know it to do this. And some of it's going to seem a little silly at first, but that's okay. I want you to, because this is basically an RxJS version of very much how Redux works in a certain way, which is that inside of a component, we're going to just say that this is a context. Okay. So this is some context. And what happens is that this context distributes something which is subscribable, meaning kind of like an event dispatcher. And there's a use effect that says, okay, well, I'm going to have a subscription to this thing. And anytime it changes, I'm going to get some data out of it. And then maybe I do some sort of predicate which says, is this important to me? Doesn't matter how that works right now, okay? But it's important to me. And if so, and even this stuff is, I'm going to just to remove it so you don't have to worry about it right now. But if it's important to me, okay, then I'm going to force this component to re-render. And by the way, when I'm all done, this component's removed from the screen, I'm going to unsubscribe. So in effect, this is what we're doing is we're saying instead of distributing the data, we're distributing a way to be notified when the data changes. And then we're keeping track of that over time. And by the way, this is one of my favorite little bits of code, totally borrowed from Redux and very amused the first time I realized what they're doing. The way that they are forcing a re-render is to have a reducer, which adds 1 to something. And they don't ever care at all about what the actual value is they came back. They just know that by calling a reducer and adding 1 to something, it's going to make this component re-render. So it was about the lightest way possible to make a component re-render. I just find that awesome. I was very excited the first time I saw that. Okay, so net result of all this is that the let me get rid of that, but that's okay. So net result of all this is that the idea is instead of distributing a value, like you can, and by the way, last thing, I know we are 3 minutes, but there's no problem with distributing a value when you have localized things that are relatively small and are going to work well. But if we ever get to the point where we need to distribute something throughout the application, we either need to understand that that implicitly means we need to re-render everything underneath it, and that's going to be what we want. Or if it's not what we want, then we have to say, well, we're not trying to distribute a new value. We're going to distribute something else. And the something else could be the type of thing that lets individual components subscribe for updates and know when they should re-render without having to re-render the whole tree in between.
All right. I think that's fascinating. And just, once again, being conscious of time, but, some folks in the audience might think passing down props is the easy way and that the model you're showing adds complexity. Can you give the group an idea of when it might indicate that you should start looking at this route versus continuing to shove props down?
Yeah, so the answer is going to be performance, right? And I'm going to bail out of this so I can see y'all when we're talking here. But the answer is going to be performance. So the reality is that anytime we're actually going to press down properties, we're going to have that render cycle. So as the application gets bigger, in other words, as the tree gets bigger, that's more and more and more and more work to do, right? So, but if I have a scenario where the distance between where I have the value, the context up top, and where I need the value gets bigger, and the components in between don't need it, that's where this is getting bigger and bigger and a better chance to use something like this. Because in doing so, what we're really doing is kind of jumping outside of the world, right? It's our warp drive. We're jumping out of here and we're updating something down here and we're leaving everything in the middle alone. So it's not re-rendering. So by way of example, Redux doing this, their performance improvement over using a React context for a big app is probably several orders of magnitude. All right. So don't start with this and maybe, understand where it's at. And I'm not even saying you have to implement this yourself, because there's a bunch of libraries mentioned in that RFC that I had TJ post that are doing this for you. But I wanted you to understand why it was doing it and what it was for, and why sometimes context can get a bad name when they shouldn't, and sometimes they should, depending on your use case, because they're a really powerful tool you can cut your fingers off with.
Yeah, Kinsey Dodge wrote an article, I want to say last year, called "Don't Fix the Slow Render, Fix the Re-Render" or something like that. I'm sure he'll correct me, but I think the idea was don't do unnecessary work. And apps tend to get bigger and more nested.
So that's the gist, man.
Yeah, no, this was great. I need you on call for any of these React APIs I have problems with. You just come in like the bat signal, right?
That's it,
come in.
Yeah. Just hold the Digital Primates logo in the air and he'll come dropping in with the answer.
And Dan, Ken did correct you. Fix the slow render before you fix the re-render.
There you go.
Yeah. But the gist of this is just to keep in mind, it's not that you should use all this. And I know this is a little bit of a weird one, but I've seen so many context related things lately and so many that are just saying do this or do that. I kind of wanted to take the time to say why you're doing one or the other and what the real issue is.
Good stuff, man. Yeah.
Nice.
Do you have anything before we wrap up? Do you have any plugs? I can drop the link to the RFC one more time in chat for people that missed it.
So Dan was gracious to help us get started a while back, the React Enterprise newsletter. We're still trying to keep that going in its stead. So feel free to Google that, go to Digital Primates and sign up. We're still doing developer related content every single week. I myself try to throw anything in there that I find particularly interesting. Sometimes it's about React, sometimes it's not, but I think it's kind of neat. So that's a for developer by developer, which I think is the phrase that got coined there. And other than that, it is nice seeing both of you, and it's always enjoyable to hang out for a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. I just got the latest issue of the newsletter in my inbox yesterday, so good work.
Cool, man. You got some friends in the chat, lots of good stuff. So really appreciate it. And I dropped the link to the Enterprise newsletter, so you could check that out. It's definitely good stuff. But thanks again, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.
Yep. Have a good one.